Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our philosophy material. This is a lecture on introducing us to ethics, of course, a major area of philosophy and one that has obvious practical applications to our daily lives in how we treat ourselves, how we treat other people. And of course, philosophers have been thinking about ethics since philosophy has been around. So it's certainly one of the most commonly cited areas of philosophy that students mention to me as having thought about before. So ethics is certainly very relevant, I think, to contemporary moral problems, whether it's abortion or other politically charged topics, whether it's gun control, climate change, you name it. There are plenty of practical applications of these moral theories. So here we're just outlining the common threads and common themes that ethics addresses. So what we want to do is lay out, again, the major theories that have shaped ethics and philosophy as long as philosophy has been around. So we'll talk a little bit about moral relativism and subjectivism, which are contained in chapter 1. We'll also briefly mention divine command theory, virtue ethics, and egoism and social contract theory, all of which have their own chapters. More specifically, we'll look at utilitarianism, a very common and popular view of ethics, as well as Kantian deontology, and then some more recent approaches to ethics, feminist ethics, as well as evolutionary and naturalist ethics. Okay, so as I said, we'll introduce some terminology and talk a little bit about metaethics and what metaethics tries to do. And one way to frame this discussion is to separate what we would call action-based moral theories from agent-based theories. So by action-based theories, we mean theories that try to look at individual actions as being right or wrong, morally permissible, morally impermissible, etc. So on the action-based list, we have views like deontology, divine command theory, and consequentialism, as well as egoism. And on the agent-based theory side, we have theories that try not to focus so much on individual actions, but rather on the agent themselves. What kind of agent should we be? What kind of person should we strive to be? That is certainly something that's addressed in virtue ethics that we get from famous philosophers like Aristotle, as well as Confucius. Agent-based ethics has a lot of appeal in kind of cross-cultural, cross-philosophical paths. So we see agent-based theories throughout Asian philosophy, as well as ancient Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy. So a lot of overlap there. So let's first talk about ways of discussing ethics. So one thing that ethics is not about is descriptive means. And by that, we mean something like the way things are. That is an important endeavor, but that is more for fields like anthropology, right? So if we take an anthropology class or we take a sociology class, perhaps history, we learn about the way things are. We talk about how people actually behave and the actions that they engage in. This is a purely descriptive process, right? It's explaining the ways in which people interact. But ethics is what we would call normative. And what we mean by that is the way things should be. So we know how people, or we try to understand and think it's important to understand how people act, right? But the question that ethics is about and philosophers are concerned with is how people should act, whether they ought to behave in certain ways. And so what we mean by normative is the way things should be, because while important, The descriptive element is something that we can learn by just looking at behavior. But that's not what philosophers are concerned with. Philosophers are concerned with the normative aspects to human behavior, and that's the purview of ethics. So this is the focus of philosophical attempts to justify why or how people should act. Though ideally a strong ethical theory should also align with what agents are actually capable of doing. So that's why we don't think that any ethical theory will do, but one that actually matches up with how people can behave. We should never expect people to act in a way that goes beyond their abilities. Okay, so philosophers and ethicists in particular focus on a number of things that should be somewhat obvious. One thing that we focus on is actions. Okay, so I mean, we all perform actions every day that affect not just ourselves, but other people and the environment, non-human animals, whether it's our decision to eat meat, or it's a decision to use plastic, or maybe it's a decision to buy our food from certain sources, right? All of these actions have consequences. So we could assess whether those consequences are good or bad. We can also assess whether someone's character is good or bad, or whether their motives are good or bad. And we ideally, or at least most of us, want to determine what the right things to do are, right? Whether those actions are right. In other words, what one ought to do. And within that, we could even break this down further. Some actions are permissible. Some actions are neutral, right? So you might think that it's morally permissible for me to drive a gas-powered car. Maybe you think it's morally impermissible. Maybe you think it's optional, it's not obligatory. Maybe it's neutral. Some people think it's morally impermissible, right? For me to eat animals, or it's morally impermissible for me to use plastics, right? So we can make further distinctions about actions as being permissible or not. Maybe you think that there are some actions that are obligatory. They're not just permissible. I'm not just allowed to do it. I'm required to do it. So there will be some examples in some of the ethical theories of actions that we're obligated to take, whether it's helping someone else in a time of need, or maybe you think that we're obligated to tell the truth. These are distinctions in ethical theories that are worth discussing. And then, of course, we have wrong actions, right? We look at some actions, whether it's something like murder or theft or lying, that we ought not to do, that maybe we're obligated not to do, or it's impermissible to do. So we're already making some ethical distinctions between different kinds of actions. Okay, why do we need to make such assessments? Well, I hope it's obvious, but there have been some very famous philosophers who have tried to motivate why we should study ethics at all. One of them is Thomas Hobbes, who we've seen briefly in some of the media and some of the reading. Hobbes famously says that we need to determine our social and political philosophy, and in consequence our ethics, to avoid what he called a state of nature, right? Because without laws, without ethics, it's essentially just a war of all against all. So think of the Walking Dead examples, the dystopian post-apocalyptic, no government, no state, everyone just kind of does what they want. So a sense of anarchy. So what's the solution? Famously, Hobbes thinks that we make a social contract. And so we have a political system that mirrors, supposedly, our ethical intuitions. So that's obviously for many people, a very motivating reason to study and think about ethics, because we're trying to figure out how to structure society. And that's important for hopefully obvious reasons. More specifically, we get into morality, right? Which comes from the Latin word mores, which refers to a network of social customs and institutions. A lot of people want to study and think we should study ethics because it alleviates human suffering. It not only keeps society from falling apart by resolving conflict in just and orderly ways, it also affects us as individuals, right? We want to, or at least most of us want to promote actions and behaviors that help people flourish. And it's hard to do that if we don't examine our ethical intuitions. Okay, so naturally, a question becomes, well, then how do we decide what is right? Philosophers typically never rely on collective moral wisdom because we've often gotten this wrong. I mean, you can think of so many examples from history and even from some philosophers who have advocated views that we no longer find tolerable. And not only that, just appealing to popularity is fallacious reasoning. Just because something's popular doesn't mean that it's right. And we've often, historically, as humans, we've failed to be sufficiently self-critical. We like to think that we're in a privileged moral position, that we have all the right answers, but then in retrospect, have discovered, hopefully, that there was a better way to do things. And we're also prone to unquestionably adopt the outlook of those around us, right? Those members of our family, our society, our culture, our religion, those have a big influence on our ethical outlook. But deciding what's right should not be divorced from practice. I think it's fair to emphasize because beliefs affect actions and vice versa. I mean, if I believe that vaccines cause autism, that's going to shape, right, whether I get the COVID-19 vaccine. So ethics has real powerful consequences for how we live our lives and how we interact with others. We also typically think that morality is not just opinions. Some people do think that ethics is all just opinions, but that's not the view of any of the philosophers that we'll examine in our course. Regardless of whether we think morality is objective or relative, moral arguments contain claims, moral and otherwise, and claims and statements can be things that are true or false. So it's not just going around asking people, what do you think is moral? And then we'll figure out everything else from there. Rather, we want to give arguments for why we should think of actions one way versus another. We also need to acknowledge our fallibility. We can make mistakes and be willing to consider new ideas, right? That's part of the main thread or main spirit of philosophy in general. And ethical theories can help provide us a consistent framework. So even if we think that an ethical theory is incomplete or not perfect, it can still give us a framework from which we can build new moral theories and think of new ways of approaching problems. Also, it can determine what is right in specific applied cases where correct judgment is unclear. So one really good example of this is the emerging field of bioethics, bio and medical ethics. So especially with the rise of things like artificial intelligence and robotics. So also self-driving cars, we're constantly trying to revise what we think is right and applying it to specific cases. What should an autonomous car do if it loses control? That might involve some ethical judgments. So we definitely think that ethics can have applicability to even issues in the 21st century. Okay, so a few other pieces of terminology by way of introduction. So again, ethics generally is the study of morality using the methods of philosophy, like logic and critical thinking. We can also call it moral philosophy. We use these kinds of terms synonymously. Morality tends to refer to our beliefs about right and wrong actions and good and bad persons or character. Moral theory is an important piece of terminology. By that, we mean a theory that explains why an action is right or wrong, or why a person or a person's character is good or bad. So we'll look at a variety of moral theories. And a moral theory should tell us what it is about an action that makes it right, or what it is about a person that makes them good or bad. So There are a couple of criteria that are worth mentioning. This isn't a foolproof list, but typically philosophers have tried to give us a way of assessing normative ethical theories. Right? We want them to be public. They should be transparent. They should be universal to some degree, right? Equally binding on all moral agents. It would be weird to say murder is bad or wrong for some people, but not others, right? Lest we be inconsistent. We also think that we tend to place a high value on reason-based ethical theories. And by that, we mean we use our critical thinking skills and our thought processes to evaluate good theories from bad. We also want them to be consistent, right? So as I said before, it should be consistent with our other moral judgments. It'd be weird to say that, an action is both wrong and not wrong, and not have a good reason for doing so. It should also be consistent with the facts of life, right? It should be consistent with how we actually live. Also, we might do well to mention pragmatism at this point. I mean, it should help us solve problems. One of the things that people like about ethics and studying ethics in philosophy is that we can apply it to real world cases when things are pretty difficult. So I mentioned bioethics. So topics like euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, that's a thorny ethical issue, or abortion, right? So ethics is supposed to help us apply certain principles to specific cases. And again, the practicality. It should be within the capacity of ordinary moral agents to perform those actions if the ethical theory is worth considering. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that we can frame ethics. The first is to talk about whether ethics is objective, because invariably many people come into ethics with the view that, well, just it's up to each person to determine what's right and wrong for them. Now, that's a very attractive view to a lot of people. That view is called subjectivism. But there are a lot of problems immediately with subjectivism, especially given the fact that we live in a very interconnected world. If you have some people who think that murder is right and other people who think that it's wrong, how do we make society function with that understanding? So as well-intentioned as many people are about respecting other people's views, it should be obvious right from the start that people mistreat other people. And we need ethics, and to be able to think about ethics in a constructive way, to not just have the conversation end with, well, you think murder is okay, I think it's not okay, end of story. This affects real people, right? Whether things like female genital mutilation is morally permissible, or whether gay marriage should be illegal, or right. That was an issue that we discussed as a culture a few years ago. Some people are still discussing it, but that affects real people, right? So for many people, myself included, it's kind of a discussion stopper to just say, well, it's up to everybody to decide what's right and wrong. I mean, that's all fine and good if that doesn't affect you. So there are a lot of issues, many issues that affect ethical issues that affect people on a daily basis, that can't really get resolved if we just chalk it up to each person is different, right? That doesn't really help us further the conversation about how to structure society and treat other people. So this gets at the heart of the difference between objectivism and subjectivism about ethics. If you're an objectivist about ethics, to some degree, you think that there are at least some moral standards that are true for everyone. At least some, not all, but there are at least some. If you're a moral relativist, you think that morality is just relative to either individuals or cultures. So it comes in a couple flavors: more subjective moral relativism and cultural moral relativism. Now, recurring problem for cultural relativism is, I mean, a culture could think that, exterminating an entire group of people would be permissible if a majority of them thought so. I mean, we've seen that in history. It's called ethnic cleansing. It's called the Holocaust, things like that. So There are some problems with adopting cultural relativism, at least philosophically. Doesn't prevent people from being relativists, but we should recognize that relativism, like other moral theories, has problems that need to be addressed by the proponents of that view. If you're a realist about ethics, you think that statements in ethics refer to entities that exist independently of what one believes. So maybe you think murder is wrong. Well, that statement refers to real things that exist independently of whatever one believes, right? If you're an anti-realist about ethics, you think that ethical statements do not refer to entities that exist independently of the mind, but maybe you think ethics is entirely internal, right? So we talked about that in epistemology. Okay, so a couple of objections that I've already mentioned to just chalking it up to relativism, subjectivism. This isn't meant to be fatal, but just something that we need to consider if we're going to be serious about ethics. Many prefer relativism since they incorrectly assume objectivism entails intolerance of different views. But this is not necessarily the case, right? We can learn and be respectful of other cultures and other traditions, even if we don't agree with some practice, right? So it doesn't mean that we have to be relativists if we're trying to be respectful of other cultures. That it's good to be respectful, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with a practice. Right? I mean, if we're going to be subjective relativists, it's easy to justify intolerances since no objective standard of tolerance can be applied. But again, we run into problems if people are coming at ethics with quite a few different views. And furthermore, if we're dealing with people who think that violence against others is permissible, I mean, that's going to have real problematic implications for trying to figure out how society should function, right? The other implication is that subjective relativism implies that on moral matters, individuals or cultures are infallible, which means that they can't be wrong. So if we're going back to the murder example, if I think murder is wrong and somebody else thinks that it's right, that's it, right? Neither of us can be wrong. But a lot of us have the intuition, even those who claim to like relativism, think that we've made moral progress. So I mentioned gay marriage, Supreme Court decisions like the ones legalizing gay marriage or the ones enshrining protections for members of the LGBTQ community. We think that's progress. Giving women the right to vote, that's moral progress. But if you're a relativist, there's no such thing as moral progress because there's no objective morality. So most of us think that we have made progress, but it's hard to make sense of progress if we're just adopting full-scale relativism. It also entails an implausible moral equivalence since the sincere moral views of any individual culture are as good or as true as those of any other. And that seems problematic, right? It seems like we want to say that the moral views of ancient Rome or the moral views of people who proposed genocide or Nazi Germany, that seems wrong to most of us intuitively. And so it seems like if relativism is true, no one culture or no one ethical outlook is better or worse than any others. But that seems wrong, right? We think that there are better approaches, most of us do, better approaches to treating other people than others. And if relativism is true, they're all equally good or plausible. It also implies that moral disagreement or successful moral reform is virtually impossible since there's no objective truth to settle the matter. Whereas most of us want to just say, look, slavery was, is, and always has been wrong. It was never okay, even though people might have thought it was okay. But if you're a relativist, it seems hard to make sense of that. Okay, so here's an argument concerning relativism. If people's moral judgments differ from culture to culture, then moral standards are relative to culture. People's moral judgments do differ from culture to culture, therefore moral standards are relative to culture. In other words, there are no objective moral standards. This is, I think, the most common form of relativism that we see. One, it moves from an is to an ought, right? It goes from, since people disagree, therefore there is no universal ought. But I mean, first of all, premise one seems false, at least to me and many others. There are standards that seem to be shared. Well, that's more relevant to premise two, but also premise one is false because just because people disagree doesn't mean that there can't be any truth in the matter. So let me give you a scientific example, right? Certain people think that the earth is flat. Certain other people think that the earth is round. By the fact that people disagree on that matter, does that establish that there can't be any truth in the matter? I mean, that seems dubious. Now, you might respond by saying, yeah, but Anthony, the shape of the earth is completely different from things like whether murder is universally wrong or universally okay. Now, we might respond to that by saying, yeah, that might be true, but we're just pointing out that the mere fact that people disagree doesn't establish that there are no facts. So we are pressing the relativists to establish why the fact that people disagree establishes that there cannot be any such thing as objectively shared moral values. That's the problem that the relativist has to account for. Yeah, so there's my example. Okay, so again, just to give a lay of the land, if we're not relativists, I mean, maybe you are, and that's fine, but you're going to have to account for the things I just mentioned. There are various ethical theories that have been given to us by different philosophers from different locations and different traditions, which is great. We have, again, action-based ethical theories, which include consequentialism, which more specifically entails egoism and utilitarianism. So these are the views that are constantly brought up, utilitarianism in action superhero movies, right? Do I save 10? Do I sacrifice one person to save 10? So maybe a war movie would capture this pretty well. That's utilitarianism at its most basic level. Egoism is the view that you should always just look after yourself. That view seems to be quite popular these days. We also have deontology, which is the view that we can use reason to determine which actions are right or wrong. So we have Immanuel Kant very famously gives us a form of deontology. We also have divine command theory, which is essentially, if we want to know what's right, we should look to God or a supreme entity, or even maybe a holy book, and just follow those rules. If we don't follow the action-based, we'll look at the agent-based. And again, these are views predominantly from Aristotle and Confucius, among others, as well as more modern feminists that try to look at whether ethics should instead be focused on individual agents and their character, right? So lots of different but interesting and motivating normative ethical theories that can help guide the discussion. Okay, so I'm not going to rehash all of these. I've already just mentioned these. There are different kinds of consequentialist theories. So egoism and utilitarianism are the biggest ones. So again, egoism is the view that we should always consider any action relative to the consequences for the individual agent. So if I'm trying to figure out what I should do, I should always perform the action that benefits me, Anthony. If I'm a utilitarian, then I think I should always perform that action that maximizes happiness for everyone involved, not just myself included. And that's going to come in two different varieties, act and rule utilitarianism. Okay, so we've already just mentioned that. Deontological theories, again, say that the rightness of actions is determined not solely by their consequences, but partially or entirely by their intrinsic nature. So this view is going to be attractive to you if you think, look, there are some things out there that are just wrong. Murder is just wrong. Doesn't matter what the consequences are. There's something about the action, the motive for the action itself that's wrong. Or other examples like rape or theft. Maybe you just think there's something inherent in the action itself that makes it wrong. It's not just bad consequences, or maybe it has nothing to do with the bad consequences. There's just something intrinsically wrong with the action. And deontology is going to have a story to tell for you if you're attracted to that view. So we'll look at Immanuel Kant, as well as divine command theory, the doctrine that God is the creator of morality and gives us instructions on how to live ethically. And then virtue-based accounts, again, cultivate a virtuous character over a lifetime. So Confucius, as well as other Chinese philosophers, Taoism, Buddhism, also have very interesting virtue ethical ways of framing this. And Aristotle himself was also a proponent of a form of virtue ethics. And then more recently, developments in feminist ethics, which promote the cultivation of relationship building and sustaining emotions like care. Okay, and then, yeah, as I mentioned, contemporary moral theories like feminist ethics approach morality aimed at advancing women's interests, underscoring their distinctive experiences and characteristics, and advancing the obvious truth that women and men are morally equal, which seems like something we shouldn't have to emphasize, but most certainly it does, given the fact that these ethical theories, as well as these ones, have been predominantly advocated by male philosophers. So we should point out that philosophy, but even more specifically ethics, has been dominated by a handful of dead white European guys, right? So feminist ethics in many respects has been born out of the desire and need, to, one would argue, to bring in perspectives that have been underrepresented and actively dismissed in centuries past, right? So this has certainly been a welcome advancement in the ethical literature. So let me leave it there. This was meant to just be an overview of what ethics is about and some of the various moral theories that are worth exploring in ethics. If you have any questions about the specifics before we move on, please be sure to reach out. Thanks as always for listening.